Okay, long-awaited video. Hopefully you've read chapters 15 through 17, and this is just your summary analysis. But we're going to get on with Great Expectations. We'll start with our summary of chapter 15. So where we left off today when chapter 14 was ultimately Pip feeling sorry for himself and feeling sorry about this apprenticeship that he's been stuck in. But he's not going to speak on it because he has so much respect and due diligence towards Joe. He tells us Joe is great. The apprenticeship is great because of Joe, and that he is sorry simply because he doesn't want to do it, because he wants to be, as we know, uncommon. And being a blacksmith doesn't lead you to being uncommon. So chapter 15 starts, and Pip is continuing to learn. He's continuing to help Joe with his learning. He does tell us that Joe typically can't remember anything from week to week. However, he is still trying to assist Joe in his learning. Now, why is Pip still learning if he is kind of set in his job that doesn't need this type of learning? Well, as we know, he wants to be uncommon, and knowledge is power, and he hopes ultimately inside that this continuing of his education could possibly lead him to something in the future. That's the only reason we can guess that he's still continuing to learn. He's continuing to learn with Biddy, who we're going to get into more in the next few chapters. We'll do a deep dive back into her and what we knew from her previously versus now. But if we go to page 117, we learned that a year has now passed since the apprenticeship began. And like we know, Charles Dickens, he very minutely tells us the time frame of what's going on. So we've had a few years pass now, so Pip is really in teenagehood at this point. But if we look at 117, right over here near the top, Pip is going to say, "Here am I getting on in the first year." So that tells us that a year has passed. And he's saying this because he's saying, it's been a year. I want to go thank Miss Havisham. Thank Miss Havisham for what she did for me. Naturally, he doesn't want to thank Miss Havisham. He wants to go see and be nosy and see what's up with Estella. Because he still, as we know, has those feelings for her with the things he was saying in the previous chapters. But he wants to go thank her, and Joe is against this. Now, we don't necessarily know why Joe is against this, but he thinks maybe Pip is wanting something from Miss Havisham, or Pip's wanting to give Miss Havisham something. And as we know, Miss Havisham pulled Joe aside as they were leaving and said, "This money is it. Don't come asking for anything else." And I think he's a little worried that Pip may be doing that, but Pip's not. Pip's genuinely, I think, being nosy and wanting to show himself to Estella again. But they have this conversation, and we meet another new character in our story, and that is Orlick. Orlick is a worker that works with Joe, the blacksmith with Joe. He's 25. It describes him as being ultimately always slouched over, just kind of like ogre-ish, broad man, typical worker aesthetic, and he is typically always there. And Pip does not like Orlick, has never liked Orlick, even from childhood, because of things that Orlick would tell him and try to scare him with as a child. But we meet Orlick, and we see a clash between Orlick and Mrs. Joe. Ultimately, Pip is taking this half day to go see Miss Havisham, and Orlick's like, "Well, I want a half day. I want a half holiday." And Mrs. Joe, being Mrs. Joe, butts into the conversation, and Orlick does not back down to her like Joe and Pip do, because he's obviously been around her for a long time, but he's not had to have that type of connection with her where he knows the true character of her being. So Orlick doesn't back down. Mrs. Joe definitely doesn't back down. And Mrs. Joe also keeps shouting, "You're going to say this with my husband standing by?" So this naturally is going to pull Joe into the altercation, and it's kind of a conflict of interest for him. Who would he rather be mad at him? Orlick or Mrs. Joe? Orlick, his worker, or Mrs. Joe, the woman he has to live with and deal with her rampages, as he calls them. he chooses for Orlick to be upset with him, and he fights Orlick. And Pip says that Joe's never going to lose a fight. He ultimately puts him in the coal dust. And at the same time, Mrs. Joe passes out. Not too sure. Says she drops. So a whole lot is going on in this instance. It's a pretty quick fight, though. Joe is, as we know, a strong man. We learned that in chapter 2, and he puts Orlick completely out. But that's about all that comes of that. Orlick, after Orlick and Joe are cleaning up together, and yeah, they really get over it super quick, and it was really just a defend your girl, stand for your honor type of fight. And I think Orlick realized it, and maybe also realized if I was in this situation, I would have done the same. If we go over to page 123 and 122, we have a change in scene and a change in setting, and Pip is now at Miss Havisham's house, even after Joe has told him not to go. He takes this day and he goes to Miss Havisham's house, and he, instead of Estella opening the gate as she usually does, it's Miss Sarah Pocket, who was one of the family members that were there on Miss Havisham's birthday a few chapters back, or chapter 11. So, it's not Estella that opens the door, so that's different. And when Pip goes in, ultimately, Miss Havisham already knows what he's there for. She's like, you're here looking around for Estella. Why does she know? Because remember, this was ultimately Miss Havisham's plan. Anyway, she devised this plan, and it's working. But Pip had been looking around for Estella, and Miss Havisham breaks the news to her that she is not here. She is ultimately studying abroad, getting her education, and she says she is far out of reach, prettier than ever, admired by all who see her. Do you feel that you have lost her? And that's exactly how Pip feels. These words were said by Miss Havisham simply to make him jealous, to make him feel like he was missing out on being with her, which ultimately he was. This is all a part of the plan that we discussed in class. This is all a part of the plan that she wants to happen. So ultimately, Pip's broke, upset, and he leaves. And when he leaves, we see another change in setting, and setting in the story is always going to tell us what's about to happen. So let's go to page 124. We're down here near the middle. How Dickens describes the setting is always going to foreshadow what is to come. So if we look at this paragraph, it says, "It was a very dark night when it was all over, and when I set out with Mr. Wopsle on the walk home. Beyond town, we found a heavy mist out, and it fell wet and thick. The turnpike lamp was a blur, quite out of the lamp's usual place apparently, and its rays looked solid substance on the fog. We were noticing this, and saying how that mist rose with a change of wind from a certain quarter of our marshes, when we came upon a man slouching under the lee of the turnpike house. When we see mist in this novel, we sense danger, we sense darkness, we sense something wrong is going to happen." When's the last time we saw mist? With the convicts. So when we see mist, we're going to know that there's going to be a dark change to happen and something bad is about to occur, and that's exactly what we see in this. Along with this, they're on the walking path, walking back, going into the village, and they hear guns from the hulks, which are the prison ships. And when we learned a few chapters ago, when you hear guns coming from those, that means there's some escaped convicts. And we also see Orlick, who is just eerie in nature and has already had that odd altercation today, and it's kind of just slouching in the shadows, and that is going to kind of point us to what may be to come, because he looks suspicious, he looks odd, and he makes himself seem odd. Going on to the end of this chapter, we learn that there has been something happen at Pip's home. He rushes home, and he comes to find that Mrs. Joe was lying without sense or movement on the bare boards, where she had been knocked down by a tremendous blow on the back of the head. dealt by some unknown hand when her face was turned towards the fire, destined never to be on the rampage again while she was the wife of Joe. So Joe went out, and while he was out, Mrs. Joe was ambushed and hit in the head and has suffered a brain injury and is ultimately unresponsive and in a terrible, terrible state. And this is where the chapter ends. So let's go on to chapter 16. Chapter 16 is filled with one of the main feelings that we see throughout this novel in Pip, and that is guilt. Guilt is eating him alive. Why is guilt eating him alive? Because he's going back in his head to a few years ago when he had his run-in with the escaped convicts. He's going back in his head with this because there are irons that have been filed off, which is just like what he helped his prisoner with. He's just feeling guilty about the entire situation, the entire lying to Joe and them still is eating him alive. And he ultimately is feeling like he could have had a hand in the injuring of his sister. On page 127 is where we see that it was a convict's leg iron which had been in there that had been filed away. So we have two people we're ultimately thinking this could be. It's either an escaped convict, the strange man, or Orlick, because obviously they had just had the altercation with one another, so that would be a very clear motive for Orlick to do it. So Pip is thinking either it's Orlick, some type of convict, or since he does have that leg iron, he's also thinking back to the strange man that had the file on him. Let's go on to page 129, and we see exactly kind of what's going on with Mrs. Joe at this point. Her sight's disturbed. She only sees objects and multiples. If you put a teacup in front of her, she's grabbing at imaginary objects because she can't even see. She can't hear. She can't remember anything. Can't understand anything she's saying. She finally has been able to come downstairs and kind of use a writing tool to be able to communicate in some way, but it's really, really difficult when you have people like Joe she's trying to communicate with who can't spell or read. Now, they have had Biddy come live with them. Like I said, we're going to get more into Biddy. Biddy has come to ultimately stay with them to help with Mrs. Joe. She can't be left alone. She has to have someone with her 24/7. In order to communicate, she needs Biddy as well. Joe still has to work. Pip still has to work. And also, those two probably wouldn't be the best caretakers for her either. So Biddy has come to stay with them and help. Joe, actually, he's still speaking of Mrs. Joe in a way, like he says on page 130, such a fine figure of a woman as once were Pip. But also, it says that he finally gets to kind of live, have a quiet life, visit the pub. He doesn't have to be seen as like that poor just person living and being leeched off of by Mrs. Joe. He kind of gets to be himself. So it's a very, very sad situation, but Joe is really in high spirits about it. They all are kind of taking it and seeing the best in the situation that they can. Now, Mrs. Joe starts adamantly writing the letter T, or as they think is the letter T, on her slate, and finally Biddy puts the pieces together. It's not a T, it's a hammer. They're like, why is she drawing a hammer? Is this what she hit with? Well, then they see in the forge she's saying Orlick. She is resonating and recognizing Orlick as being with the hammer. So they run in there, get him, and when they bring him out, they're hoping that Mrs. Joe has some type of epiphany that shows and some emotions that show he's who did it. However, she doesn't. She motions for them to give him a drink, and she wants him near her. This kind of takes away anything that they were thinking that, wow, we've just caught him, by her showing us this, because now it's kind of the opposite. It's like, oh, this is showing us that he probably wasn't the one that did it, and Orlick seems just as confused as they all are about why she wants him there. But remember, her memory is messed up. This could just be a coincidence of some sort. And now we will go on to our last chapter that you were to read tonight. I know this is longer than I planned for it to be, but you know, when I get going, I can't stop. Chapter 17. This is a great chapter where we really get to see kind of a romance bloom. I mean, like, we have Estella before, but I don't know if that was a romance or like just a, you know, set up disaster waiting to happen. But we get to see a little romance bloom. It's not the best romance, and it has some problems, but a little. So chapter 17, we find out another year has passed. So time is ticking with these chapters. How I know this is because he goes to Mrs. Havisham's for his birthday, because it's ultimately what she asked him to do. And he does, and he says this becomes an annual custom, so every year he does this to go and see her. And she does give him a guinea, but he tries to deny it, and she gives it, and that is fine. Let's get into Biddy. So Pip notates some changes that have happened with Biddy from the time when she was his teacher, when she was living with her other family before she came here. He says at the bottom of page 132 that her hair grew bright and neat, when before in the, I don't remember exactly what chapter it was, but in the chapter we were introduced to Biddy, it said her hair was always a mess. It says now on page 132 here that her hands are always clean. Previously it said her hands were disgusting. However, he goes on to say she is not beautiful. She is common and could never be like Estella. But she was pleasant. So, is he enjoying her company? Yes. Is he starting to see her in a different light? Absolutely. But once again, he can never he can never find the good in anything in his life right now, because of those few moments with Estella at Miss Havisham's estate that genuinely changed the trajectory of his entire life. Once again, it tells us that it's been a year since the last chapter, because it says that Biddy has also been with them for more than a year, and she just came to them last chapter. So here once again is Dickens giving us a little glimpse of the time that's going on. Now, Pip and Biddy have become very close with learning, just kind of becoming friends in general. And he wants to take her on this Sunday walk. And she's for it. I mean, they're friends. They are what they are. Mr. Joe stays home with Mrs. Joe one Sunday so they can go on this walk together. Now, what we think is going to be some type of chemistry spark, some type of romance revolution, it kind of is, but it also is damaging in a way as well, for definitely for Biddy, but kind of enlightening for Pip. However, remember that Pip knows better. Pip knows what he wants. Biddy doesn't know better. So this is just the lifestyle that she is used to. Anyways, Pip decides that he wants to open up to Biddy and tell her things that he's never told anyone, things that he's even kept from Joe. And he says on page 135, I want to be a gentleman. When he says gentleman, he does not mean he wants to be like chivalrous. He doesn't want to be nice, open the door for someone. No, he wants to be uncommon. He wants to be a rich man. He tells Biddy this, first time he's ever told anyone. He confides in her that he has no desire to be a blacksmith. He does not want to be in this apprenticeship. He does not want to work in the forge with Joe. He wants to be a gentleman. And Biddy is just kind of like, are you okay? You're not happy with how you are? She's kind of taken aback by what he says, but she listens. And then when we get to 136, we see that he's still having all of these memories of Estella and Miss Havisham's house. It starts by saying that while he's talking about this, he wants to pull out his hair and kick the brewery wall like he did on the day that Estella called him common. He's feeling all those feelings again just even talking about it. He ultimately then opens up and tells Biddy that why he is this way is because someone told him that he was common. He says in 136, instead of that, see how I'm going on, dissatisfied and uncomfortable, and what would it signify to me being coarse and common if nobody had told me so? So he tells Biddy, I would not be like this if someone hadn't called me coarse and common. He tells Biddy that Estella is ultimately the entire problem, what has changed his entire life. Biddy keeps asking him questions about Estella and this romantic moment that they're supposed to be having. At the bottom of 136, Pip completely ruins it if he hadn't already by saying, the beautiful young lady at Miss Havisham's, and she's more beautiful than anybody ever was, and I admire her dreadfully. So he already told Biddy, like, you could never compare. But Biddy so naturally and so nicely just continues asking questions, trying to get more into Pip's brain and more into the bottom of why he feels this way. After he's done confiding in her, also he does kiss her, which is so confusing. But Biddy goes with it, and all is fine. When we get on to page 139 and 138, at the bottom, he starts kind of comparing in his head Biddy and Estella, and genuinely besides beauty, he can't say anything that Estella is better than Biddy at. He actually says that Estella would cause him way more pain than Biddy ever would, that Biddy would take pain while Estella would cause pain, but it doesn't change from the fact that he has this drawn out desire for Estella. Kind of like just a general thing in life. If you want something you can't have, you want it more. And that's kind of what Pip's going through with Estella, because it's not just Estella he wants and he can't have, it's also the lifestyle. He wants it and he can't have it. But he does list those differences and he pinpoints those at the bottom of 138. And then on 139, he gets away from Estella and gets into his feelings for Biddy. However, are they good words? No. But he says, if only I could get myself to fall in love with you. You don't mind me speaking so openly to such an old acquaintance. So he ultimately tells her, I don't think I can fall in love with you. I wish I could. But there's Estella. And he pretty much tells her, like, I think our life would be great if I could fall in love with you, but I don't think I can. And that is ultimately their romantic Sunday walk that they go on. It's him confiding in her about Estella and then kind of telling her, like, I wish I could be with you. I wish I could want to be common, but I just don't. Is this going to stop Biddy, though? Genuinely, no. This is her lifestyle. She doesn't know different, so she can't want different. She's not been to the Miss Havisham's estate. She's not fallen and kind of been coerced by a guy in higher class. So she doesn't know this desire and this pull to be anything but common. Then finally, we get to Orlick again, and Biddy ultimately says that Orlick's been flirting with her. She doesn't like that, and Pip kind of has a little jealous spute about it, which is interesting because he's just spent the entire last few minutes talking about Estella. Now, at the very, very end of this, Pip shows us that he is actually torn between life, because some days and some moments he can be fine with his blacksmith job, and he can be fine with the forge, and he can be fine with Joe, and he can be fine with this common life. However, there goes Joanne. However, in an instant, every single time he's thinking of this, he's like, no, I want that higher society. I want that big role. I want to be a gentleman. Just at the end, he just had to ruin it. But he wants to be someone that he's not, and ultimately these few chapters really show us that. I think he's going to do everything in his power to get to where he wants to be. Okay, I know that was long, I'm so sorry. Chapters 15 through 17, we will read 18 and 19.